Dear scientists, doctoral candidates, students, and dear colleagues, it's my pleasure to welcome you on to the sixth International Excellent Talk. I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Karen Renaud, Senior Lecturer at Strathclyde University in Scotland, a specialist in the field of cybersecurity. She's referred to as one of the top 2% of influential researchers in the world. Research Day at KIT is part of her long-lasting collaboration with the scientific group of Professor Dr. Melanie Volkamer from the Institute of Applied Informatics and Formal Description Method, AIFB at KIT. Dear Dr. Renaud, we are very much looking forward to your talk and will be delighted to welcome you at KIT in person next year. Dear Professor Volkamer, the screen is yours.
Welcome also from my side, so that you spend kind of the evening with us. There's one thing I want to add, and it was already mentioned, that Karen is kind of more than a usual research collaborator for myself, but also for the entire SICSA research group. We have been starting collaborating back when I was in Darmstadt. She was a co-supervisor of two of my former PhD students. She likes Germany, and she came over to Darmstadt several times. She already visited us at KIT, as you can see on the right side. So we are planning to work on password managers to see what is necessary that they get more widely used and that people are not scared to use them, and also what needs to be done from the password managers to become more usable. I would like to hand over to you, Karen. I'm really looking forward to your talk, and having said this, the floor is yours.
I'll start off by saying a big thank you to Melanie for all the years of wonderful collaboration and for the very nice introduction, and also to Dr. Ross for her introduction, and to Eleanor for her very professional organization of this event and always being so accommodating when I send emails. So at the bottom, you will see the University of Strathclyde, which is where I work. I joined them in January, and although I'm very much there in spirit, I haven't actually been on campus yet. So I want to talk about moving from humanist problem to humanist solution in cybersecurity. And I'm going to start a little bit by talking about, and the crime statistics across the planet are not great, but these are the statistics I downloaded this morning from the USA. And you can see that, the USA at least has a huge problem with cybersecurity, 30,000 websites hacked each day, lots and lots of issues that they are facing. And 1/3 of US consumers, and these are the people that I really want to look at, is the individual. And you can see that there are huge costs to what's happening in the cybersecurity domain. The phishing attacks is the way people are targeted, lots of ransomware payments being made to criminals. It's not a good picture right now. Now, these are USA statistics, but this morning I also downloaded this statistic to show that Germany is equally under attack from cyber criminals. The US being a little bit lower down, but not that much. So the picture is not great. Now, we know we have a problem, but the solution to this problem depends on us correctly identifying what the source of the problem is. So we don't want to just take the view of, well, here is the manifestation, and we're going to try and fix it. Until we understand the real underlying cause of the problem, we cannot really come up with a solution that is going to work. So we'd like to use some examples from history to show how people in the past have identified the wrong solution to a problem, and only once they got to the right source of the problem were they able to solve it. So you may know that in London many years ago, they had a big cholera outbreak. Lots and lots of people were dying of cholera. And at the time, they told people that these are the problems. This is the source of the problem, is that people are eating raw vegetables, that they are drinking cold water, and that they are getting wet. Now, the interesting part is today we would consider a lot of those things to be healthy things, but in those days, that's what they blamed the problem on. So you can see they had completely the wrong source of the problem. Then people said it was the really bad smell that was coming from the River Thames that was causing people to get sick, because the smell was so awful that people assumed that the smell was going to make you sick. But then a man called C.P. Snow, Dr. Snow, he thought, well, he wasn't going to just take the anecdotal reasons, and he started to map the deaths from cholera. And he realized that just all these deaths were clustered around the same water pump. Now, the pump you see on the left is still in London today. Obviously, it doesn't work anymore, but that's where all the homes were getting water from. And this pump was contaminated with sewage. And so many, many people died. So the minute he managed to get the people in charge of the country to shut this pump down, the deaths stopped from cholera. And they didn't understand germ theory back then. It was in the a long time ago, but they understood that that pump was causing it. So once they identified the source of the problem, they were able to deal with it. Now, in this country at the moment, we have a lot of stabbings. We have a major problem with knife crime. And this is another area where a lot of people disagree about what the source of the problem is. And you can see we have a 15% decrease in England and Wales in the last 12 months, but we still have many, many offences. And you can see the number of deaths in the year up to March 2021 is 221 recorded murders involving a knife. This is so what is really the source of this problem? Some people say it's all the immigrants that are coming into London. This is this particular news report. Other people believe that we have other, kind of other issues here, which might be causing the policing resources, which is no doubt true, that the police have been cut. Other people say, oh, it's all about drugs. Yet other people say that we have an issue because we're not keeping people in jail for long enough. So if they commit an offense, they're just letting them off the whole time. This is the mayor of London who says that the problem comes from people on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. Not quite sure how that one works. And then he changed his mind and he said it was budget cuts to his police force that were to blame for knife crime. So you can see lots of people coming up with lots of different explanations. But the solution they're proposing, because most of these explanations are crime related, are saying, well, we need to give the police more power to stop and search people and to arrest those that are carrying knives, and then you'll prevent it. One member of parliament, I think, is very ashamed or embarrassed of the day that he said that every single knife in the UK should have a tracker so we can track where it is. Now, this man's face has been disfigured by something they call the Glasgow smile. This has not happened very much anymore, but let's say 100 years ago, this was very common. And there was a lot of knife crime in Glasgow, and they would slit people's faces like this. Now, because of this kind of thing happening, Glasgow has the biggest hospital in the entire country for facial reconstruction. And these are the best specialists in our country are located in Glasgow because we have a lot of had a lot of knife crime. And Glasgow also went through all these explanations for why we are having these problems with knife crime across the country. But then this lady here, who's a policewoman, said, no, this is not a policing issue. This is a public health issue. So we need to figure it out from a public health perspective. We need to go and speak to these lads. We need to go and understand how we can prevent this violence by dealing with it as public health. And this was quite a revolutionary way of looking at things. But because of her intervention, Scotland has managed to reverse the trend. The knife crimes, the homicide cases, which were mostly based on knives, because as you might know, nobody is allowed to own a gun in the UK. The knife crime came down very well, and Glasgow has become the city that is an example for the rest of the United Kingdom. And you can see that the numbers have come down very well. I couldn't get the numbers from this year, but I assume they'd be as low because many people have been under lockdown. And now London is saying, well, there's a solution that actually addresses the real cause of the problem. And so we're going to try to go to Glasgow and figure out what they're doing right. So these are examples. And a quick third example is, I don't know what the German word for scurvy is, but many years ago in the 1700s, people who went to sea as sailors, they often died of a disease called scurvy. We now know scurvy is caused by a lack of vitamin C, but of course they didn't know that in those days. And they said it was a digestive disease caused by blocked sweat glands. But James Lind came along, and James Lind went on a ship and discovered that these sailors were all ill. He found 12 sailors were ill, and he did one of the very first clinical trials, which is pretty amazing. And he gave different sailors different kinds of treatments. And the 2 sailors who got the fruit, they got better. Now, James Lind didn't know why it worked, but he knew how to treat it. So he sort of come up with a solution without really understanding the problem. But in all 3 of these areas, a lack of understanding of what was really causing the problem was preventing people from coming up with a solution. So what is really the problem in cybersecurity? If we understand this, maybe we can try to start solving the problems that we have across the globe with cybercrime. Now, if I go and do a search, I see that 1/3 of data breaches are caused by insiders, as in humans who work inside organizations. Okay. I also see from this source that 95% of data breaches are caused by human error, that it's delivered by email and people are clicking on emails, obviously, and 56% of cybercrime is brought on by either current or former employees. This is not a good picture that this is painting. And of course, we all remember in 2017, there was the WannaCry attack. And what was really interesting for me, because I was keeping a very close eye when this started to happen because it hit the United Kingdom really hard, that one of the very first responses to this were, well, some person clicked on a phishing email, and that's why we're getting all these WannaCry ransomware attacks. In fact, the blogger was completely wrong. It was not based on phish, but it does show a mindset where the very first explanation for things is related to, well, some human did something stupid. I see other kinds of, a quick search and you can just find a lot of these. This is ENISA that publishes a lot of statistics and reports across Europe, also saying that a lot of the problems are caused by insiders. Once again, the humans inside the organizations. And businesses are basically acting on this presumption. This is a lady in the UK, actually in Edinburgh, in Scotland, who was sued because she fell for an email scam. And when it went to court, the judge said, no, he didn't, I'm sorry, he didn't agree. He said that the fraudster is the real culprit. So stop blaming your own employee. But the company fired her anyway. So there's a lot of evidence here, just anecdotal evidence, I realize that, saying that actually the industry, you're seeing the human as the weakest link, as the problem in cybersecurity. So we went looking for a rigorous way to go look at a wide range of stakeholders to see whether we could find rigorous proof for this perception. Once we can think about how people are formulating the problem, then we can see whether it's possible to change the mindset, because we have to change the mindset because what we're doing now is not really working. So this is a lady called Carol Backey. She's published this book called Analyzing Policy. And this book teaches a technique called problematization. So let me show you how this works. Problematization says, well, what is the problem? What do people think the problem really is? And then we look at what the effects that are produced by our understanding of what the problem is. Then we say, well, what assumptions have been made to lead to this perception of what the problem is? How did it come about? What is the source? Then finally, you get to the point where you say, well, how could we question this? Is there a way to actually question this perception? And how could we think about it differently? So problematization is really a very rigorous way of moving from the current state to a potential idea for a better way of tackling a particular issue. And we used public documents. So we looked at what governments were saying in their cybersecurity policies. We looked at what industry was saying in their reports that they issue usually yearly. We looked at what hackers were saying. What were hackers saying about people, about how about they targeted people or systems. And then finally, we wrapped it up by looking at what academia was saying. So, if we understand the problem, we can move on and we can move to a different mindset. So the first step is, what is the problem? So what we first got to understand is that we're not just working with a human and a computer, we're working with an entire socio-technical system. So we have people and we have technology. We also have processes that the organization has put in place, processes that software enacts. And then we have governance. which comes from both outside from the government, but also comes from organizational governance, like the boards of directors and people like that. And then we have a lot of external influences, maybe from other organizations. So we started off by looking at the Five Eyes countries. You may know about this coalition that was formed at the end of the Second World War. These are the English-speaking countries, and these countries share intelligence. It's called the Five Eyes. And so we went and had a look at their cybersecurity policies and analyzed them very carefully to extract information about what they said the problem was. We then looked at eSecurity Planet, and these were the names of the top cybersecurity companies across the world. And so we looked at their yearly reports and what they were saying. Then we looked at hackers. So we had to find where hackers had actually made statements or where there were court cases that we could get hold of what had been said in the court by the hackers. And we looked at what they were saying about what the problem, what they targeted, because clearly what they were targeting was what they perceived to be the weak link. Now, we then redrew that picture of the socio-technical system to make it easier, and we put some threats in each area. And then we went and had a look, and you can see the kinds of problems that we drew and whether the governments were saying there were problems and whether industry was saying there were problems. And I mean, the first one that came out from all these documents was lack of cyber awareness, a knowledge gap, in other words, lack of accountability, lack of compliance. These are the kinds of things people were saying. And we can keep going. There were a lot of the policies were saying we need to detect these cyber criminals and prosecute them. There's not enough innovation. There were all these different kinds of problems that were emerging from our analysis. Now, if you paste those problems onto the socio-technical system diagram, you can see that all except two of them are actually related to people. The one that isn't related to people, P11, is related to innovation in cyber, which I guess could somehow be linked to people. But P15 is hostile nation states that are attacking other nations. That could kind of be related to people, but it's not really a person problem. It's more about geopolitics. So, and then we finally wrapped up by going and looking at the top conferences that published human-centered security research. And we saw what were they mostly focusing on? And they were mostly focusing on the individual. They weren't really looking at the bigger socio-technical system and the influences that exerts on the human. So what we have is a conclusion that the real problem in cybersecurity is your human, either the individual at home or the employee in the organization. And this picture that I found using a Google search really encapsulates attitudes towards the employees in organizations. Now, I didn't come up with the idea that maybe this was a wrong way of thinking. So in 1999, Anne Adams and Angela Zase published a paper that said users are not the enemy. And it's really quite surprising that 20 odd years later, we're still sort of thinking that the user is just a problem to be fixed. So what are the effects that are produced by this kind of perception? So I was inspired but in this diagram by somebody called Wouter Hart, who wrote a book which translates to Turned Around Organizations. And he was explaining that when you consider the human to be a problem, you do everything you can to exclude, train, control, and constrain them, because you've got to control their tendencies to want to make silly mistakes. And so everything is constrained by the processes, and the technologies are put in place to constrain humans as well. The whole stance here is to resist attack. And when something does go wrong, when there's a cyber event that occurs, they will generally carry out what they call a root cause analysis. And this means who messed up, who's the bad apple, so we can deal with them. So this is very much an outer inwards process in an organization. And Wouter Hart was pointing out that this is a real issue in organizations, right? And he was looking at it from a management perspective and saying that this is a very ineffective way of managing people. I applied it to cybersecurity. And then we talk about what assumptions have been made, right? This is the next step in the problematization process. And the assumptions really are human is a problem. We've kind of shown that. But it builds on an assumption that socio-technical systems can be composed into their separate parts. And that kind of doesn't really acknowledge the fact that these systems, when they interact, sometimes you get emergent and unpredictable behaviors. That it's actually because these systems are so complex that you're actually getting sometimes chaotic behavior from the systems that you cannot anticipate. But anyway, the next assumption is that we can actually prevent people from making errors, which I've already spoken about, that as a consequence, this is the right approach: exclude, train, control, and constrain. The third thing is that people can make policies that, if you follow them and comply with them, could prevent all the possible errors. And the fourth one is that a resistance stance is the right way to go. So this is what we call cybersecurity currently. By the way, I should have mentioned from the start, I did a great deal of this research with Verena Zimmermann from from Technical University Darmstadt. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. How did this representation come about, this approach to the way we do cybersecurity? Well, this is when I started my career in industry, this is the kind of computer I worked on. Now, if we think about it, these computers used to be in big rooms, and you can see there were terminals and people worked separately, but you couldn't actually get into these rooms. It was all very tightly controlled. And if you wanted something, you had to phone them and ask them, please put that tape into the machine so that we can read it. So there were a lot of concerns on a physical level. They were always worried about people coming in from outside and trying to smash the computer with a hammer or something. And so what came out of that was something called a compliance approach, where basically, here are the rules. If you want to come into this room, you have to do all these things first and sign off and do a risk assessment and whatever. Now, because that is where we came from in the 1970s, we have now developed, what has kicked in is something called path dependence. And path dependence says that when you start with something, that thing exerts a massive inertia pressure on what happens in the future. So that is why path dependence is why we're still using the QWERTY keyboard instead of the Dvorak one, which is a much better keyboard in terms of typing speed. It's impossible for us to create it because everything builds on the fact that we started off with that one with the old-fashioned typewriters. Now, remember, I was talking about scurvy. Lind basically showed that fresh fruit was needed, but the Royal Navy did not want to listen to him. And it took 50 years before the Royal Navy started to issue lemon juice to all sailors, and that was the end of scurvy. And that's really surprising if you think about it, that it took 50 years for them to do that. But that is the power of path dependence. So in cybersecurity, we also have path dependence. So some years ago, I did some work with some folks at Glasgow University asking, why do, we've all been locked out of accounts, but why do you only get 3 tries? Why can you not get 5, 7, or 9? And nobody could really answer that question. And even now, 7 years later, I still don't have a good answer to that question. And the other path dependence we have is that people think that complex passwords are the best passwords, a password that looks like uppercase, lowercase, special character or number and all these things. But in fact, in 2017, the guidance changed completely. The guidance now is use 3 words. But a lot of people haven't caught up with that because, once again, path dependence kicks in and prevents this from happening. People have to then kind of be persuaded to abandon the old way they're doing things. So how can we question this representation, and how can the problem be thought about differently? Well, Professor Kahneman, who writes a lot about the human mind, says, well, you can either try pushing people into the right behavior, which is kind of what we're doing with the word compliance, or you can ask, why aren't they doing it already? What is preventing people from doing what you want them to do? And Peter Drucker, who writes a lot about management, says it's almost never an individual employee's fault that if something isn't getting done. It's the system that is faulty in some hidden way. And this comes back to my argument earlier that when we're working with a socio-technical system, it's massively connected and it has emergent and strange behaviors. And some of those behaviors will influence the employees. And if they're not doing what you want, you should go and look at your entire system. The biggest problem is that we probably have taken the techniques that we know have worked in dealing with physical risks, and we've tried to take them to the cyber domain. But the physical world, we understand gravity and we understand a lot of things that are dangerous in the physical world because our fathers and our grandfathers dealt with these risks. But the cyber world, the cyber criminals create a moving target all the time because they're endlessly innovating and changing their techniques. So we cannot use the same approach that we use for other threats. We are dealing with chaos here. So on the right-hand side, we have obvious things, clear, structured, and so on, and complicated systems. But those systems, you can train people to cope with them. So people, as long as you have the manual and you follow the manual, you can build a car. That's complicated because not everybody can do it, but it's not impossible to train somebody. But when you're dealing with a system where we call zero-day attacks, which are attacks that criminals come up with, nobody's anticipated, those vulnerabilities are there within your organization, and nobody's quite thought about how to prevent this happening. So now what we're dealing with is complex and chaotic systems. And training does not work very well here because training only works for things you've anticipated happening already, not the kinds of things that the criminals are discovering on the fly or coming up with and innovating with. Now, George Lucas very kindly allowed me to include some of his slides next. So George Lucas is very interested in this idea that everybody thinks technology can solve the cybersecurity problem, but not humans. And George Lucas went and looked at the 3 top cybersecurity conferences and discovered that only 3.5% of the publications looked at the human factor. Now, if you consider the fact that conferences are basically presenting solutions to problems, only 3.5% thought it was worth trying to find a solution to the human factor and the problems that humans experience in behaving securely. So he started looking at could we consider the human, instead of being the problem, as a sensor which is superior to the actual technical systems. So he went and tested, he came up with a number of innovative attacks. And as you can see, he's tested whether antivirus picked up these attacks and whether browsers picked up these attacks. So these are, once again, the technical solutions are very good at picking up attacks that they already know about. But if a hacker has come up with a zero-day attack, they don't know about it, they don't pick it up. And as you can see, the technical systems did not perform very well with these kinds of attacks that they had decided to test. And once again, just to explain, a zero attack is where there's a vulnerability that somebody has discovered, and the hackers have sites that they share vulnerabilities. So the minute one finds the vulnerability, will either get sold to other hackers, or it will just get put on some chat window and shared with other hackers. Then a lot of people will start attacking. Now with the SolarWinds attack, it was a really long time before they discovered it, and they almost discovered it by accident. Their technical systems did not discover it. A human saw that something strange was happening on his system, and he uncovered the entire SolarWinds attack. And that really was like all the dominoes going down, because then they realized how widespread this was. But it was on their systems for ages. Now, the WannaCry attack is somewhat different because a patch had been released, but a lot of people hadn't applied it yet, and that's why the hackers were able to exploit it. Both of these, the technical systems did not stop these attacks from happening, but especially WannaCry, a human, a particular ethical hacker in the United Kingdom managed to stop that attack in its tracks. So both times we needed a human to both discover and stop the attack. Now, George Lucas took exactly the same attacks and then applied it to humans. So H1 to H26 are particular humans, and they volunteered to be part of his experiment. And you can see that 10 out of the 11 attacks were detected by at least one person. And this is important because if those people are all in an organization and talking to each other, then the 10 of the 11 attacks would have been resisted by that organization because the human sensors were able to detect it. This is a really interesting study because it shows that technical solutions are not always the wonderful cure-all that technical people think they are going to be. And what about phishing? So for years, we have tried to explain how links work so that people could learn to spot fake URLs in phishing messages. The assumption was that we should try to make people URL parsing experts, and I did this too. But the hackers always were somehow ahead of us. The hackers, we would teach people these techniques, and the hackers would then start deploying new techniques. And so it started, you know, is there another way, rather than trying to help everyone to understand URLs, which, by the way, some people find really difficult to do, especially the senior citizens who don't have that kind of mental model. So I discovered a researcher called George Finney. He's actually not an academic. He works in a US university where he's in charge of cybersecurity. And what he has done in his organization is to teach people mirroring, a technique he calls mirroring, which says, try to think how a hacker could be trying to use this email to deceive you. So he gets people to think on a higher level. And this has been incredibly successful in their organization in reducing phishing success. So, you know, we've kind of got to start trying to encourage humans to be these sensors rather than trying to train them to be the experts that we are. So in terms of turning the paradigm shift that I proposed at the beginning of the talk, I was inspired by these three writers: Sidney Dekker, who's been trying these techniques in the safety domain; David Marquet, who actually turned around his nuclear submarine; and Wouter Hart, who writes about turned around organizations. So the first assumption we had was the human is a problem. I don't know if you're aware of this, but when the Sony hack happened a few years ago, the day after the hack, they brought the FBI in to give a lecture to all staff about good passwords and phishing detection. But in fact, that's not how the hackers got in. The hackers managed to compromise the system without the help of any human being at all. And that, you know, that really just demonstrates once again how humans are always blamed. But hacks have got, you know, as I said, these systems sometimes behave unpredictably. The hackers are changing their tactics. And so what we've got to start thinking of is, how can we help the humans to be a solution in our training, to really become more adaptive. The approach currently is to exclude, control, constrain. And we tell people, yeah, just do what we're telling you in these policies, and they become rule followers. So when you make somebody into a rule follower, they go, okay, fine, I'm going to give the responsibility to the person who wrote this policy and come up with this process. But we're actually stifling their ability to spot anomalies. Compliance works in a lot of areas, but it doesn't work when the game changes all the time. So what we should do is defer to people's expertise in their areas of expertise and ask them, how can we help you be secure in your area? And we might need to tailor things for what they really need. What about policy adequacy? And once again, policies, when you write them, they look backwards, they look at attacks that have already happened, they look at for predictable, unexceptionalist attacks. And of course, many of the attacks we experience are unexceptionalist, but the ones that get through our defenses are generally the new attacks that are exceptional. And in those cases, policies are too old to help at all. So at the moment, the policies present a mismatch between the defender, who's kind of reacting to what they know, and attacker who's proactively attacking the organization. And so there's a massive belief in policies. What we should do is encourage continuous learning so that people can keep up with all the latest exploits and know and be aware of them, so that they're looking out on them. So forewarned being forearmed. The big assumption is that we can prevent errors. We can prevent people from doing stupid things. And we're acting as if there's one best way. But the new view says, well, look at the whole system. So what we call this is focus on success. So I worked somewhere one time, 200 members of staff received the same phishing message. One person fell for it. For the next 3 days, everyone spoke about the one person who'd fallen for the fish. But actually, to my mind, we should have gone and looked at the other 199 people and said, why did you not fall for that fish? Tell us how you spotted it. And then we can help the one who did fall for it so that he won't fall for it again. So by focusing continuously on errors, we just lose all the learning that we can get from focusing on success. Then we have this whole bottom right, the foundation of everything in the socio-technical domain is that we can decompose a system into its parts, but we're massively connected. There are emergent qualities of massively connected systems and a lot of unpredictability. So when you try to find one person whose fault it is that something went wrong, it's just unrealistic to try to blame the person who clicked when there were 5 or 6 causatives that happened beforehand that led them to making that mistake. So we have to understand that these systems are emergent and complex, and that we actually cannot break them down to try to identify bad apples. And the resistance stance. So here you can really learn from when they first created cars. They created a wheel like the one on the left. This wheel was designed to resist the very bad roads they drove on in those days with lots of stones and things. These wheels kept breaking and falling apart. And then they realized, no, that the wheels have to be able to give a bit, right? It needs to be able to absorb the shock that comes from the stones and things. And that's why we have tires these days that have air in them, because they are not merely resisting, they're resilient. And that's why, okay, we still have problems with those tires occasionally, but nothing as bad as they did in the old days when they used the ones on the left. So we can now take Wouterhart's inspiration again and say that we should use the human as a solution, and everything we do in the organization should be, well, how can we build that human's capabilities? How can we help them learn? How can we build collaboration in organizations so that the human can really be part of the security perimeter? The human can be our best ally, but not if we're pushing them in a corner and telling them they have to comply with what we tell them. We say, you're part of the solution. What happens when a cyber incident happens? The question isn't who, the question is why. Why did this happen? What things were put in place that caused this problem to occur, so that we can fix the system? Because otherwise you can fire one person, but if you haven't fixed your system, it will come back to bite you, and another person will fall into the same trap, but you won't get security. Remember, what we're dealing with is complex and chaotic with emergent qualities, and so you need a systemic approach. Focusing too much on the individual really is like putting blinkers on a horse. You just don't see the other stuff that's there, even though it's there waiting to trip you up. So what we propose is something called cybersecurity differently. And this just encapsulates all the things I've spoken about, but really builds on the acknowledgement that the systems are unpredictable, complex, and emergent behaviors occur. I know you might be sitting there thinking, this will never work. She's totally crazy if she thinks we can change everything. But what we're doing right now isn't working either. And, if you keep on doing the same thing and expecting different results, there was a wise man who once said that you're probably insane. So we need to try to think about something different. Now, this is an example that I found online. This is a little village in Holland called Drachten. Now, Drachten had a huge problem with this intersection. There were people getting killed every year. You can see there's lots of signs. The more signs they put up at this intersection, the more accidents there were. And the people who were in charge of this town were tearing their hair out, just not knowing what to do. And so this guy came along and said, well, he knew what he was going to do. And he took out all the signs and all the traffic lights. And you may think, oh, my goodness. But there were no more fatalities, because now security became everyone's job. They didn't just have to listen to the traffic lights anymore. They had to look who the slowest moving person was in that square, and they had to look out for that person and make sure they didn't knock them over. They solved their problem with actual fatalities, right? They solved it by actually removing all the rules. And this worked. And it's completely counterintuitive, but it worked. Now, Sidney Dekker, the man I told you about earlier, he managed to persuade this company in Australia. So they had all these safety signs all over, and the staff were given safety training once a week with all the new directives coming from the head office. So a few of the stores decided that they were going to try something new. They removed every single safety related sign, and then they said to the staff, there's only one thing that you have to do, and don't let anyone get hurt. That meant that if somebody dropped water, they would immediately wipe it up. If somebody saw a hazard, they would immediately remove it. Now, what happened was that these stores, I think there were 6 stores that he persuaded to try this new way, won the safety prize that year because they had the least people getting hurt in their stores. This is, my father always says, nothing succeeds like success. These people might be onto something here. This is David Marquet. who he was the captain of a US nuclear submarine. And his submarine had the highest turnover in staff asking for transfers to others. It was an unhappy ship, and he realized he had to do something different. He then started to apply some principles. These are the principles he applied, and they look very similar to the ones that we have given you earlier. That he says, fix the environment, not the people. Push authority to information, so allow people to make decisions about how they behave securely. Just give them the rule, be secure. And focus really on people, on achieving something rather than avoiding errors. And he has now, his ship, after he implemented all these principles, has won the prize for the best nuclear submarine in the US Navy. Well, before he retired, he's now retired. And he gives these kinds of lessons and talks to people all across the US now, trying to explain to people how you can really change the way you run things to be much better for the people working in any organization, but also in terms of outcomes. So cybersecurity currently is focused on the human as a problem and making sure they don't mess up. Cybersecurity differently is focused on really empowering, right? In helping people to collaborate, but not blaming. People should be able to work in a blame-free environment where everyone is working together. And if somebody does make a mistake, they will be helped to learn from that mistake. But building resilience is really important, because if you're building resistance, you don't have the ability to respond if the organization gets attacked, because everything just falls apart. Now, I know that this is a big ask, and I know this is a big paradigm shift. And I also know that path dependence is going to lead people to go down the right-hand path. But the paper that Verena and myself published has now been cited 51 times when I looked this morning, and was only published in 2019. I think that's a good sign. Maybe enough people will read it so that people will start thinking about their approach to employees within organizations. So in conclusion, we have been treating the human as a problem, or even as the biggest problem, ever since cybersecurity came into being. And it is really time for us to value people's abilities to detect anomalies and to make every employee an equal partner. Other fields have shown us that this is possible, and I do hope that we can do it as well. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be very happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Karen, for your very interesting talk. For me personally, I always have a problem with the passwords. And I'm now starting our question and answer sessions. What role do you think user experience plays in helping people detect such anomalies?
It's interesting, because user experience is a little bit like usability. You want to make the person's experience with the system as popular as possible. But in doing so, you're also working reactively. You're working on what you already know. So obviously, yes, we should make user experience as good as possible and usability as good as possible. But I think what I'm arguing for is more of a perception about how we can enable people to be those human sensors. So maybe what we're looking for is transparency. Can we help people? Can we make what's happening under the hood of the system a little bit more visible to people? So that we can empower them to be able to help us to make our systems secure.
So from Melanie Volkammer, do you have some concrete recommendations what a CISO at KIT could do to start following your proposal?
I think that's what we want to work towards. So at the moment, it's very much a thought experiment, and also knowing that there's something good here, because these 3 people have written about it and they've applied it in their fields. What I would need to do is, find some organizations that will let me work with them to move towards more of this approach. I think we have to test things in real life situations. I can't talk about how social technical systems are complex and then think I can, as an academic, come in and solve their problems. I have to be in the organization to solve their problems. So I would love to have some concrete recommendations in a year or 2.
So you mentioned that cybersecurity has a global perspective. What role do you see here, the policy and especially policy coordination?
It's interesting. That's also a very good question, because when we looked at cybersecurity policies, security policies that published by governments, most of it is really about what businesses should do, what governments are going to do to protect infrastructures, what governments are going to do to catch cyber criminals. Very little is related to supporting the end user, supporting individual citizens, supporting or how organizations should treat their employees. So I think, we've published this, and I just hope that governments are going to start seeing the potential of end users in really helping us to secure our systems from these cyber criminals.
I'm interested in global commons. So, and as such, we know that global commons have various dimensions, and it's not only global health or the climate, but it's also a cybersecurity.
Yes.
And then you always have the problem that in order to find a solution, you have to coordinate at a global level.
Yes.
How especially, well, I would have a little bit the fear that right now we're discussing that the problem lies in the person, but then it might also be the problem lying in the politicians who are not able to understand the problems and how to deal with it. So I'm just wondering if you look at it from this perspective as well.
I think the Five Eyes countries are quite tight in terms of sharing. So, if one of those countries detects a new attack, they will immediately tell the others so they can prevent it. But of course, that's just 5 countries. I think the European Union is starting to think about things like sharing that sort of intelligence as well. So it's happening, but once again, the countries maybe in Africa are just not getting that intelligence. So we need better ways to share, obviously, yes. That's part of the resistance thing, but also part of learning from how are these people attacking. But also there's a lot of, I have a student working in cyber diplomacy, which is a really interesting area, whereas basically countries attacking other countries, and that's another level of problem we've got.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so how do we deal with that? So especially like the SolarWinds attack was attacked by apparently Russia on the US. So the US expelled the Russian diplomats, but they're still, the attack still happened and all that stuff. How do they recover from that? This is another level of looking at things altogether. Maybe we do need to start at the organizational level, and then when that starts working, maybe the bigger players will see it. But you also touch on a very important point. Politicians don't understand technology, let alone cybersecurity, or maybe not all of them, but let's say a lot of them. So you try and talk to them about stuff, and they will automatically, it's like, the old saying, if all you've got is a hammer, everything is a nail, right? So all they have is, right, we'll use the police. We're gonna solve this as a crime problem, where they don't understand that they've got to solve it as a collaboration issue. Maybe it is a lack of collaboration. Getting the politicians on board, that's a big challenge. I obviously, yes, what I was trying to, what I would do in the cyber domain is to stop expecting compliance and starting to give people the freedom to innovate in this space. I think when you're continuously talking about compliance, and when you don't comply with something in a policy that you actually know is not really secure, it's not helping you be secure, and you get disciplinary procedures if you don't listen to the thing, but you actually know you should be doing something different to be actually really secure, then can we stop doing that to people, and rather saying, let's work together. If you come to me and say, what you've written in this policy is not possible for me, let me try to change it so that it's more empowering than preventative or constraining. I think we're going to have to figure out how to implement this thing. I mean, I clearly don't know how to do that yet. At the moment, it's very much something we feel needs to happen, but the devil is always in the details.
What is the role of an innovation culture in making this new approach a reality?
So this is a very interesting. We just did a study on shame and how organizations react when people make mistakes. And what we discovered was that if an organization starts blaming and shaming people for clicking on a fish or doing something silly, the person would become very angry, and they might at that point then become an insider threat to the organization and start behaving unethically. And that's an organizational culture. It's just something they do anyway. But when they do it to somebody in the cyber domain for a very honest cyber mistake, they create a person who is malicious towards the organization. But if they treat the person well and say, look, it's okay, we all make mistakes, we're going to fix this. Can you learn from what has happened? You know, what I've been arguing for. What they then get is enhanced loyalty and people who really want to behave securely. So if you have a bad organizational culture or an organizational culture that really doesn't treat people very well, you are going to have less security. That's it. And so people kind of, I think organizations need to wake up to this fact.
I think that I will just thank Karin once again. Thank you for this very interesting talk. Thank you. Thank you everybody for being with us today. And this will be this last talk in this year. So we'll continue in January. If you would like to get the updates, just follow our YouTube channel or visit our website, or just wait for the announcement, which we will definitely send to you. Okay? And thank you once again for this talk, and thank you everyone for being with us today.
Thank you.